Hey, Marissa, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. I'm super excited to get to talk to you about your creative process and where you come from and all kinds of stuff in between. So, where are you
Sure.
from?
So currently I'm based in Chicago, moved here a few years ago. But I was like raised in kind of middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania.
Oh, okay. Okay. Were you in DC at any point? I noticed that there was DC in some of your website information, like you maybe had some creative time there?
Yes, I went to school in DC for college and then stayed there basically up until I moved to Chicago.
Oh, okay. Awesome, awesome. And so you are doing audio work specifically, right? That's sort of been
hmm
your focus for most of your creative career, or did you start exploring creativity in another way?
I think it's definitely always been audio. I enjoyed creating stories and things like that when I was little, but my most recent project was the first time I've had a story of my own that's been published. But I originally started out wanting to do composing more than the
Mm.
audio production work that I do now. So I really was gung ho towards being a movie composer until
Oh,
about
great.
halfway through college.
What happened? What happened halfway through college?
Honestly, nothing bad. It wasn't like I, kind of fell out of love with composing or anything, but I had kind of done a double major where I was doing a music major and also an audio production degree. And I think
Mm.
just around that point was where we were really starting to have hands-on experience. My school had a recording studio, so getting in there, being able to record some different musical artists and also having the chance to record some narration for documentaries, I kind of realized that being kind of behind the booth doing the technical stuff was more of what I was interested in instead of composing.
So it won out in the end, the behind the scenes aspect of production then.
Yeah, it was kind of surprising because when I went to school, I didn't even realize, not didn't realize that audio production was a thing, but just it didn't really seem like something you just like stumble into, but through kind
Mm.
of a series of meeting the right people and just getting to try my hands on some different projects, I kind of realized that it was a viable career and I think something I was better suited towards versus composing.
Oh, that's great. So if we may backtrack just a little bit further, then what kind of stuff were you enjoying as a younger person when you were first getting into music or production, or finally kind of getting a taste of what it's like to be inspired by some works when you were younger?
Yeah, I think probably around the point that I realized that music was kind of like a viable career path. I think I was around 15 or 16. Some of my really big inspirations, the two were the Pirates of the Caribbean movies
Mm.
and um, actually Tron Legacy, which I have kind of mixed feelings on the movie overall, but the soundtrack was incredibly influential to me, and kind of realizing that those two, as well as the video game The Last of Us, just kind of
Mm.
thinking about how impactful the music was to all three of those, and realizing like, it's possible that maybe I could try my hand at doing something like that as well. And I think for me, kind of really those like epic sweeping scores and also I really like 80s music, so
Mm.
seeing kind of like synths
Oh yeah.
blended together with those epic scores in Tron Legacy was kind of like a moment where I realized like this is something that I'd really want to do and just really love those projects.
Oh, that's amazing. I actually have to defend Tron Legacy because for whatever reason, like that was one of the first movies that my son and I watched together, and to actually be taken in by the way that the music was put together, and it was a father-son story and that sort of thing. So I was like super
hmm
emotional or super moved by that combination of music and film coming together that I actually really loved it. And I know it's kind of a divisive thing in the fan base, but I do think that there's something special about the way that there's something magical that is added by just music existing. I mean, case in point, you have the John Williams moments, the Hans Zimmer moments, even something like Dune or even going back to Jaws or something like that. There's always something powerful about that. And so you felt like like Tron Legacy and those movies really imprinted on you in that way? Like you realized the potential of what music could do?
Hmm. I'm trying to think which of the two of those was most impactful. Um, Honestly, though, I think the most impactful probably was the first Last of Us game in terms of that. Because I remember I don't want to spoil it too much just in case someone listening hasn't played it, but basically right before the intro credits play, there's like a very impactful, abrupt, sudden, very intense scene, and then it kind of cuts to this, melodic guitar. And I remember uh seeing that for the first time and just like how I felt in that moment. I felt sad anyway because of what happened, but then kind of having that calming guitar afterwards just kind of I don't know how to explain it. It just really blew my mind of like how perfectly that music was able to capture and amplify my emotions.
Yeah.
And I think that other scores had done that too, especially the two that I mentioned before, but that particular moment I remember very distinctly as one of those like aha moments.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, that was Gustavo Santaolalla, right? He was
Hmm.
oh my goodness. I've been following his work for a long time, and I'm not a video game player, and so I'm very slow to catch up on what's going on in the video game world. But I remember hearing that and having that be such a success that makes perfect sense because you have somebody who is able to maximize with so little, right? And I'm not sure
Hmm.
if the soundtrack is like that most of the time, but is it mostly fairly sparse in terms of composition or arrangement?
Yeah, a lot of it is very centered around solo guitar, and there will be like some accompaniment, but especially in like the really soft emotional moments, it'll only be solo guitar, and it also kind of fits into the main character in that series plays guitar and talks about it a fair amount, and in the second game kind of uses that as like a bonding moment between him and the other main character, Ellie.
Oh, that's awesome. It makes me want to play video games, but I have no hand-eye coordination. So I feel like I wouldn't get very far in the game. But looking at the way that you approach composition, can you tell me how you, I don't want to say became proficient because it's obviously a learning process for everyone and it's an ongoing thing, but what do you feel was sort of your starting point when you got into the world of composition and coming up with your own things?
Yeah, I think honestly, I do think that, my theory classes and the classes that I took in school definitely helped me develop sort of my language and being able to describe my process and kind of, knowing the words to think it through. But I think most of my process came from, I guess, initially trying to practice imitating some of the composers or bands that I really liked, just
Mm,
for practice, and then slowly starting to realize what my own style was, especially, you know, kind of going through music school. Sometimes more modern, kind of think like 1980s forward isn't super taught. So a lot of it was me listening to a lot of film soundtracks from the 80s to present and yeah, kind of studying those in my free time, but also having the language of that classical training to being able to describe what I was thinking and kind of blending those together. So I'd say that my music tends to be the instruments tend to be very synth heavy, and I'll occasionally use sound effects as well, just because I love working with sound effects. But some of the backing behind it and the chord progressions tend to have more of a classical base.
yeah, that's wonderful to hear. And having the pleasure of listening to some of your samples that you have on the website, especially the soundscapes, were so wonderful. I love the alien planet one, and
Thank you.
there was one that you had where you were sort of setting the scene of looking at the stars, and having that kind of feel. I thought that was just so remarkably effective, especially with the sound. So could you talk to me a little bit about how those two things converge, those two disciplines, because it strikes me that you have a very strong sense of both of those things, but bringing them together might be a special kind of soup that happens. So, could you share a little bit about what that's like?
Yeah, I'll be completely honest. I think that a lot of the process that I stumbled across was just trying to smash things that I really enjoyed together.
Mm.
And, if I could show you, my old hard drives from college, they're just full of like test session one and test session two and like, just full of all sorts of, pretty mediocre sessions. But I think at that point, I think I was really struggling to decide whether I wanted to go down the path of either, sound design, audio production, or still stick with music composition. And it felt like there wasn't really a reason for me to not pursue both. So I think it definitely took a lot of effort to get to that point where I could, blend those two things together. But I think it was just really trying to strike a balance between like, yes, I definitely still do want to compose, but I also don't want to, ignore this audio production
Yeah,
stuff that I'm
yeah.
starting to get into. And, especially at that time too, learning how to do field recordings. I wanted to kind of use that as inspiration for my music.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. And it seems very effective in the way that you've used it. And I think in terms of narrative, that's so effective because as I was listening to Liars and Leeches, which is the show that I'm hoping that we'll get to talk about here in a moment, I noticed that there's something missing in most audio dramas that I think you got right here, which is the ability for somebody to hear the narration or the dialogue in a very clean way, right? It's not distorted for particular effect, but you still get a sense of the room that they're supposed to be in. And I think that's such
Mhm.
a very interesting bit of technical know-how that most don't really have a chance to look at, because I was listening to the first episode and we could tell when they were in like I think the grocery store, right?
Mhm.
And the protagonist is talking to the cashier, and then you move them over to their home, and there's a completely different room tone. And I really just kind of wanted to celebrate that for a moment because it's just so powerful, and it's a narrative thing. It's not a technical thing. At some point, don't you think?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I'll try to not get, too far ahead of the questions, but
Yeah.
both I and the sound designer, that series, her name is Melissa Pons, both of us come from a technical audio background. And for me, this was the first time putting a story, together like that. But basically in our, our meetings and discussions, we were trying to figure out ways to take that technical knowledge because we know what to expect from certain rooms, how they resonate, how the materials in the room would resonate, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So we really wanted to translate that technical knowledge into the series, and I think it's definitely better for it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it was a lot of time talking about room tone and what clothes people would wear, what shoes they'd wear, things like that.
Oh, that's fascinating. And I want to ask you a whole bunch of stuff about that because it really intrigues me. But if we could kind of set the stage a little bit about Hemlock Creek Productions, because Liars and Leeches seems to be sort of like something that you had been working toward for a while. So could you share a little bit about that part of your artistic progress or your career to how you arrived at Hemlock Creek Productions?
Yeah, sure. This might be a little bit of a long-winded answer,
I
but
love that.
basically, post-college, I kind of struggled with this idea that for most productions, they needed to be based in either Los Angeles or New York. No shade to either of those cities, but at the time, I really liked DC, and now I really like Chicago, and I felt frustrated. Some of the first productions that I worked on were remote productions. Did a little bit of work with Fool and Scholar, which was at the time I based on the west coast of the United States, but the voice actors were all over the place. And I was just really frustrated at this idea that you either need to relocate to do what you love or have to be really lucky with remote work. So I decided that I wanted to create a business that focused specifically on remote editing. Um, and, my initial goal was like, hopefully this will take off. Maybe someday I'll be able to make a show, but that's probably going to be like a decade down the line. Let's just see how things go. Started the business in January of 2020, not knowing what was going to happen in March. And it kind of, I was very fortunate that in that time period, Hemlock Creek did very well, just, kind of working with people who either couldn't travel to studios for safety reasons or, trying to help bigger studios where their engineers didn't have a lot of experience doing remote recording.
Mm.
So it ended up accelerating sort of my 5 or 10 year plan a lot faster. So I'd hoped one day that I could, make a few shows while still editing externally for other clients, but that came a lot faster than I expected. It's been about 3.5 years.
Oh, that's phenomenal to hear, because it also seems like you've incorporated every single one of the facets of your creative interests, which I think makes this so effective. You have behind the scenes audio engineer work, and you also have film work, music, as well as dialogue. So did you notice a specific genre or form being more popular than others during the pandemic?
In terms of specifically audio dramas, or in
Like,
terms
how
of,
much were you
films too?
doing? Like, was it mostly audio books or dialogue or films, or what was the majority of your work during the pandemic?
Definitely in the beginning, it was mostly audio only. So it was, some podcasts. I think I did a little bit on an audiobook, but a lot of it was just really, audio focused, smaller groups, things like that. And then as the pandemic went on, I think some of the bigger companies started to adapt their processes as well. So starting to work with some bigger production companies. And then I would say maybe after about a year of the pandemic, that's when more films started to trickle in and a couple
Oh, right.
games. But yeah, definitely for the first year, I think everyone was just so, overwhelmed with everything that happened that, adding those additional things like a visual element was incredibly difficult. So pretty strong pivot towards podcasts at that point.
Right. So I imagine you had to deal with a lot of maybe hand holding in terms of helping the talent set up from home, or was that something that you dealt with a lot, or did you just deal with the aftermath of cleanup crew in terms of the audio?
That's a good question. I think it really depended on the production because there were a few people that were like, we're really out of our league trying to do this right now. Like, we want to bring you in to kind of consult and help us set up the actors, things like that. And then there were also a few that either they just kind of went ahead and recorded on their own and then sent me the files, or there were a few cases where it was, I guess, hybrid, where people had started recording before the pandemic and then couldn't finish. So that
Mm.
was definitely the trickiest situations of just trying to like match those recordings to pre-pandemic uh, recording standards, I guess.
Oh, wow. I can't
Um,
imagine that. Yeah.
yeah, a little tricky, but we made it through.
So you come out on the other side. I mean, not that we're done with the pandemic or anything. It's just kind of an ongoing mess here. But it seems like, as you said, business is adjusting to this kind of work. And right now, what is your primary project? Is it Liars and Leeches, or is it sort of going alongside other things that you're working on?
So I guess there's kind of three big ones right now in terms of my personal work. Liars and Leeches is definitely the biggest one. This was my first time doing a lot of things, kind of creating the story, directing things like that. So definitely moving forward with season two, but trying to take a long chunk of time to really assess, what went well, which was, I was very pleasantly surprised with how well everything went, but, things that can improve, things like that. So that's the one thing. Also working on, some projects for external clients, a couple weekly shows, a couple bigger projects, mostly in the audio only space. And then I'm also currently not freelancing, contracting at Naughty Dog, working on their games as well.
Oh, wow. So that's a completely different facet that you're dealing with as well. So, in terms
Yeah.
of video games, though, what do you think is the biggest challenge of getting it right? Or say if there was something that you felt that you had to learn very quickly in terms of dealing with video games and working in that, creative space. What is it that you felt that you've had to overcome to be effective in that?
I think it's just a very different way of thinking about creating and editing, because with films and podcasts, it's going to sound the same, every time you listen through it. Nothing's going to change, nothing's going to be in a different spot. But with video games specifically, especially outside of cutscenes, you really need to assess things in sort of a changing way, because every person that plays a video game is going to play it in a slightly different way, so things like timing and volume will be slightly different depending on when certain lines fire off. And I work mostly just doing dialogue for games at this point, but it's just something that I think took me a while to wrap my head around, of like, this might sound perfect this time through, but when I retest it and play a slightly different way, is it still going to sound good?
Yeah, that's the baffling thing, because there could just be so many permutations to the actual presentation that you're like, I can only control this little piece. Is like, how is it gonna fit into the larger scope of the experience? I mean, I can't imagine that. But do you have a moment that you remember when you were dealing with dialogue that you had a breakthrough? If you're able to share, like, maybe an anecdote from those times when you had those.
I'm trying to think of what I can say
Yeah,
on a
yeah,
recorded podcast.
right. Or if you want to open it up to another experience, if we could go back to something where I know that sometimes eureka moments aren't as common as we'd like to think, but I know that they happen, and I'm curious if you've ever had something like that where it allowed you to do a 180 on the creative process.
I would say my eureka moment in dialogue, it's probably going to sound so nerdy, because dialogue is kind of considered to be like, a lot of people think of it as very um, technical, very by the book, not a lot of room for interpretation. But I think something that I did recently was learning how to edit very small dialogue efforts. So that's things like breathing, sighs, whispers, things like that. And um, most of my experience in podcasting before had been kind of a very similar level of speaking, not a whole lot of those smaller moments that you might see in a video game. But I
Hmm.
think working on those and realizing how much nuance there is to how humans communicate, even with those, sort of non-dialogue things like sighs and, you know, how you breathe, I think that really helped influence me in my podcasting work, because I think a lot of podcasts don't necessarily tap into those minute levels of detail. So I think recognizing that, this is very important to this video game, but I can also put it into Liars and Leeches, I think that actually helped that particular project along a lot, of just thinking and directing, how can I direct these breaths or these sighs
Yeah.
in a way that can really bring out additional emotion, that I think if I had tried to direct Liars and Leeches before working on those video games, it wouldn't have sounded as detailed as it ended up being.
Oh yeah, I can only imagine. I mean, the greatest thing that I noticed about episode one as I'm listening to Liars and Leeches, which I can't wait to get to the end of the season. Hopefully, I have a little bit of time. Just don't release anything new yet because I'm a slow listener. But there was this great interaction when Tanya was talking to her friend, and they were having dinner, and the timing of the dishes in the conversation was just something that struck me, because it's not something that's out of place. I mean, it has resonance, and I thought this is somebody who knows how to direct in sound, because that again is just narrative stuff, and I'm like, how did you get there? And you just explained that completely. Like, it is seeing how those little things make a huge impact. And not to belabor this, but I wanted to see if you could tell me a little bit more about Liars and Leeches, how it
Mhm.
came to be, and sort of where we're at with that a little bit more.
Sure, in terms of the story itself or kind of the audio behind it.
Let's start with the story since we haven't been there just yet.
Sure. So I think a little bit of background on me. By far, my favorite genre of anything is always horror. I ever since I was probably like 9 or 10, I used to be like a, a pretty big scaredy cat, but by the time I hit 9 or 10, I was like constantly watching horror, really loved like the old ones from like the 20s and 30s.
Really?
Just, yeah. And
Yeah.
I've, uh, you know, just I think there's something really interesting in horror about how it takes, especially supernatural horror, takes real life fears and exaggerates them in a way that
Mm.
you can potentially fight or win against them in a way that you might not be able to in real life. For
Mhm.
example, if have you seen Nope?
I started it and I haven't finished it yet, but I can't wait to finish it because it is brutal from the onset. And I'm right
Yeah,
there with you. So yeah, yeah, share a little bit more. That's great.
yeah. So without spoilers, something like Nope, kind of being a metaphor for exploitation in Hollywood, like if you're trying to fight against exploitation in Hollywood, it's not going to go the same way as in the movie. But I just love how concepts in real life can be abstracted like that in horror.
Hmm.
So I wanted to do something similar with Liars and Leeches without getting into too much detail. I had a personal experience with gun violence in real life, and I kind of wanted to. I think also living in the US, it's a fairly common occurrence. So I kind of wanted to take those feelings and experiences that, me and people around me have experienced and kind of abstract them in a way that they could be, I guess, more easily dealt with. So that was kind of where the beginning story of Liars and Leeches came from. But I'm hoping that with following seasons, each season will be taking on a different emotion and abstracting it in some
Mm.
way. So season one is definitely fear, but the other seasons will be different.
Oh, that's incredible. And this is such an effective start to the podcast season because as I'm listening, you do this wonderful thing where you put us in the headspace of Tanya as she's going through, it is almost a PTSD moment, and the way that you achieve that with music. And again, I'm trying not to spoil anything because there's a lot of like nice little twists and turns just in the first episode alone, but it's so effective. And again, we go back to sound. We go back to that bed of additional I guess nuance that you're able to create. And I guess we can kind of get into the technical aspect of it just a little bit more, and we can try to get a sense of how you put the story together, how you worked with writers on this, or how that process came to be, just so that we don't spoil anything.
Sure. So this process, I think it honestly came a little bit out of a personal pet peeve of mine, which is where audio is kind of considered to be an afterthought and isn't really brought in until usually at least the script is written. And in some of the projects I've had, it's not brought in until I'm not brought in until all of the actors have been recorded, pretty much get handled, a little file with a bow on it that's like, here's everything we recorded, have fun.
Oh
And
goodness.
I think I've personally been very lucky that I've worked with people that have gotten some really excellent recordings and, haven't rarely had to do any like retakes or things like that. But since I was starting this project from scratch, I kind of wanted to have audio be the front and center, especially with it being an audio drama. Um, the process was originally that I wrote the story and had a writer come in. I'm not a very good dialogue writer, so I created the story, but our writer KJ Scott is the one that took the outline and turned it into, the actual script. But as the script was being written and created, I also brought in our sound designer Melissa, and began consulting with her immediately before we'd even done any recording or even casted the actors because there was a fair amount that kind of having two people well versed in audio looking at it realized, we're going to have sound effects here. We don't have to have the narrator double up, things like that, that I
Mm.
think we definitely trimmed down this script and my outline a fair amount to make it more audio friendly. And I think having that extra step at the beginning made it turn out very smooth and polished and a good balance between what the narrator is telling the audience and the sound design itself. Because even before we had any dialogue recorded, we kind of already knew what it was supposed to sound like.
Yeah. And if I may just kind of pry for just a moment, was there ever a moment where you felt like you needed to abandon this? Like you're like, this isn't going anywhere, or maybe we're going up against a wall. What happened there, and how did you overcome those dark moments where you didn't feel like this project was going to see the light of day?
I think for me, the scariest part and the part where I felt very unsure was in the casting and directing portions because, I've at this point am getting close to a decade in working in audio. So I was like, I know I got the post-production stuff is down. We got that. The pre-production stuff I think felt a little less nerve-wracking because it's like worst case scenario, I decide to end this project and it would suck to not see it through, but um, you know, no harm, no foul. Maybe I'll pick it up a different point. But I think the scariest part was after the casting happened and we were getting ready to do the recording sessions because I'd sat in some recording sessions before and seen directors work, but this was the first time doing it. And I think the total cast ended up being, including a brief line by myself, there were 21 voice actors.
Wow.
So I think at that point, I don't want to say I was full panicking, but was very concerned that I'd bit off more than I can chew.
Hmm.
And I think it turned out really well because I, was able to use the lessons I'd learned from previous, you know, voice directors that I'd seen work before. But I also just happened to be very, very lucky with who I casted and their experience levels. So I think we were able to complement each other pretty well. And um, once we, got all the recordings and were ready for post production, it was pretty much smooth sailing. But that directing part was pretty nerve wracking.
But you came out on the other side feeling like, okay, I can do this again. So because throughout that whole thing, you didn't strike me as like a fatalist about it, like, oh, woe is me, but rather like you're continuing to learn, right? And take on more down the road.
Yeah, I think so. It was kind of more of the imposter syndrome
Mm,
scenario, I think, and especially with bringing on the cast members at that point because, paying the sound designer and writer at that point was like, okay, we've already done some work. They've gotten, paid, even if this doesn't move forward, they've gotten something. But especially with the cast, I really didn't want to either do a poor job directing and have that reflect on their acting skills because of something that I did, or um, decide not to move forward with the project, in which point 20 people are, you know, may have denied other work because they wanted to work on this. So I think it was just kind of a lot of pressure at that point. But then once kind of actually got into the swing of things of directing, it got a lot better.
and I can imagine that it's great validation to see that this is an award-winning show already. I mean, as you mentioned, this won Best Audio Drama at Edit Play in the Swedish International Film Festival, and just recently an official selection for New Jersey Web Fest. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I was pretty surprised that, we were able to go that far that quickly. It definitely made me feel reassured about what we created. But even then, even if we hadn't won any awards, like I was just so incredibly proud of what we created that it was kind of like an added bonus instead of like, oh, thank goodness we got, picked.
Uh-huh. Right, right. And I have to ask you, as you mentioned in your bio, as a Black and queer owner of this audio production company, do you feel like there is a personal threshold that you're crossing as you are taking this production company on your shoulders and bringing these projects to life and bringing visibility to your community in that way?
I think yes and no, because I think when I first started out working in audio, and kind of the reason that I wanted to start my company is I was not seeing a lot of queer people or Black people in this space. So I kind of wanted to increase visibility there and did, some advocacy, some teaching, things like that. But I think what I've come to realize is that there are a lot of us out there. It's just a matter of working with each other and lifting each other up. So I'm really grateful to have been able to find other people through the course of my projects, but I think advocacy is something pretty near and dear to my heart. So I try to do a lot of teaching. Have also done some, I don't know what you'd call them, I guess science fairs or camps or things like that, where especially, teenagers that are kind of at that point where they're considering going into careers and just kind of
Mm.
letting them know, like, hey, there are, queer people and Black people in this industry too, and like it's for you. And I've often been told by people like, oh, we're the first, non-male person that we've seen like doing audio, and people act surprised. So I would like it to not be that way anymore, but I'm gonna try as long as I can to increase visibility.
Yeah, and I think that you're doing a phenomenal job at that. It's just incredibly inspiring to see because the work is of the highest caliber, and it's really exciting to know that you're out there doing your thing. So I do have a couple more questions to be mindful of your time here, but this has been such a blast, and I'm really looking forward to not only listening to some more of your original compositions, but to continue the podcast because it's actually really intriguing and it's right up my alley. But looking forward to perhaps we can't really talk much about season 2, but maybe we can look in maybe some things that you're trying to improve on for your craft. What are some things that you've noticed, in the last 10 years that you feel like I wish I were better at this, or I wish I could improve on this? Have you zeroed in on some things that you'd like to work on moving forward that you think are like your next frontier?
I think in terms of the audio, um, that's kind of hard to zero in on because I feel like I have pretty solid, uh, kind of base level skills, but
Mm.
audio just changes so quickly, especially with, different softwares and things like that. It moves pretty fast. So I think I definitely always want to keep improving my audio skills and just trying to work on as many different projects as I can because I feel like I learned so much from every single one. But I would say my overall skill that I really want to improve more is my writing, because I think I have a lot of stories that I would like to create and share, but in terms of writing, that's definitely my weakest spot. And having a script writer like KJ able to help with Liars and Leeches helped tremendously. But I think I have been looking towards taking classes and things like that to just kind of improve my story making skills. So that's probably what I'm going to be turning a lot of my attention to in the next couple years or so.
Oh, that's awesome. That's going to be great stuff for you. Really exciting to know that another writer is joining the fray because it's always good
Thank
to
you.
get some voices there. And this is the second to last one here. For somebody who's looking to start their audio journey, maybe a young person of color or, a queer person who is about to begin their journey, or maybe just anyone who's at the very beginning, what would you recommend to somebody who doesn't know where to start to begin audio post-production?
That's a really good question. I would say that my advice is kind of in two parts. I would say on the technical side, I think a lot of people when they start out get really, how do I say this? They get very caught up in the technicalities of audio. I know when I started out, I was very nervous about taking on new projects, even as a junior, because it was like, well, I did live sound engineering for a fair amount. And, I remember being super nervous because it's like, yeah, I know audio, I know how to edit, I know how to mix, but, this is live sound that I don't have that much experience in. So, I had an internship that I almost didn't try to go for because I was worried about that last little component of what I didn't have instead of focusing on the fact that at that point I think I'd been in school for 3 years and done a fair amount of projects. So I would say definitely focus on the skills that you have and don't be afraid to take shots just because you're still learning. Because I think even at this point, I'm definitely still learning every day, and I know I will be for the rest of my career. So I would say that's the main thing, and then kind of less away from the technicalities, but I would say find your community in audio, because I would say, my schooling and my education was definitely a fantastic baseline for me, but I would say I've learned so much from just people in my community, or, people I've just reached out to, like, hey, I really like this sound design you did on this particular show. Like, how did you do this? Or, like, just kind of talking to people that way, and not trying to just befriend people to get ahead, but genuinely building connections and learning from people. I think for a while after graduating school, I was just kind of like ramming myself into a wall of trying to, move forward, but not actually reaching out to people around me and asking for help, or getting to know them or anything like that. So by the time I started actually making community things, it just got so much easier.
That's amazing. And lastly, I want to ask you if there's something that you've experienced recently in terms of media, whether it's a podcast, film, video game, or, a book, anything that has sparked that creative interest again, or has made you wander or dream again.
Oh man, I feel like, honestly, especially recently, I know people have kind of talked about, horror, or not horror, movies are dying, and, I don't want to watch any new movies, things like that. But I feel like in the world of horror, just so much has just exploded during the pandemic, and there have been so many good movies and games and things like that that I've played. But I would actually say my answer would have been different if we'd done this, a couple days before. But I watched last night the movie They Cloned Tyrone. Have
Oh,
you?
I've heard of that one. That one's on my list.
Yeah, I think usually I tend to get inspiration from, the audio in cinema, but just without spoiling it, I would say that the three main characters in that particular movie, they just felt so real and so human, and the every line of their dialogue was amazing. It was, parts were
Mm.
heart-wrenching, parts were really funny, and, like, I think a lot of the things that I've been watching recently have had really good writing, but that one in particular really struck me of like, wow, I want to be able to write like that someday.
Oh, that's incredible. And that's an amazing note to end on. So, Marissa, I want to thank you so much for creating this amazing work that you're bringing out into the world. I'm really, really thrilled to get to learn what happens to these characters at Liars and Leeches. So I hope that folks will check it out. But I also want to thank you for your insights and for being a badass, and for really creating your own thing. I mean, this is incredibly inspiring, and I can't thank you enough for your time. This has been a blast, a total blast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was amazing. Those were really insightful questions too.
Awesome. Well, I will leave you be, but I will be in touch real soon on the internet, okay?
Okay, sounds great. Thank you so much.
Thanks again, Marissa. You take care.
All right, thank you. You too.
Bye.
Bye.